Have you ever watched the movie Social Network? Because if you have, it's a very entertaining movie, but it's just rife with a whole bunch of inaccuracies. In analyzing what actually happened, a number of the mistakes that they made early on were things that we've actually talked about in this very podcast. So if you're interested in hearing the truth about some of those mistakes, stay tuned.
So the movie The Social Network was really entertaining, but it was just a little bit disconnected from maybe reality as we know it. You know, sometimes Hollywood loves to take a little bit of license to make a movie more exciting, or maybe to demonstrate a point more so than maybe it happened in real life. But if you were watching The Startup Lantern, our series, you may have noticed that there are several things that we've covered in some of our earliest episodes that could have helped Eduardo Saverin address some of the challenges he faced in that movie and in real life during the creation, development, and ongoing creation of the Facebook legacy. So join us now as we walk through several of the lessons that are learned from the Facebook during its foundation. I'm John Duran. Thanks for joining us, and welcome to another episode of the Startup Lantern.
And I'm Drew McFarlane.
So before there was Facebook, there was ConnectU, a project that the Winklevoss twins had undertaken to develop something that really would have become a competitor, or at least similar to what Facebook became. There's a lot of lessons that we've talked about in earlier episodes of the Startup Lantern that also address some of the things that happened to the Winklevoss twins. Drew, I think some of these really come back to the early issues of how important the people are that you work in the company, how important it is to hire versus maybe partner or include them in the early parts of your company. So I'll let you talk to that a little bit here.
You really need to ask yourself the question honestly, how crucial is, each member of the team? Can the company exist without them? And if if the company doesn't exist without these people, then you need to figure out exactly how to, you don't want to treat them like an hourly employee in that circumstance, because there's no loyalty there and they can just move on. In the case, with the Winklevoss twins, they absolutely were trying to just, make Mark Zuckerberg an hourly employee. And as a result, he didn't feel any obligation to particularly help them. Now, in the movie, they sort of make it seem like it was an absolute. He was going through and kind of copying what they were trying to do there, and there was some similarities in general. But during the discovery phase of the trial, what they didn't touch in the movie is they actually got a whole bunch of the text messages, and it was actually pretty clear that that Mark Zuckerberg was kind of stringing them along to avoid having to have any negative comparisons. So he never really executed on that. And really, what ended up happening is Facebook out executed Harvard Connect and ConnectU. It's Facebook came out, and Harvard Connect was just literally a thought of that a couple of people had, and very little else beyond that. So again, one of the constant pieces of advice that we give here is execution is everything. Whatever it takes to get first to market. So treat your people, like their partners if they need to be, if they deserve to be, and make sure that you execute on all 4 cylinders or 8 cylinders.
I think the important part. I think one of the important parts right there is that what they actually were developing was really more of a software product at that point, and Mark was the developer that they had hired. So actually not having the core developer for their software as a key member of the team allowed him that opportunity to be working on something else, which ultimately became a superior product and effectively tanked their product. Yeah, the next big thing we noticed, which was really interesting, I guess I didn't realize that the first initial entity of Facebook was founded in Florida as a Florida company. Coming out of Silicon Valley, that seems really odd. But It was also founded as an LLC, which we talk about in an early episode. It's really important to found your company correctly because if you create a company as the wrong type, in this case an LLC, it makes it much more difficult down the road on how you apply the stock, on how you change the funding, even some of the things about how you hire and deal with the organization can be more complex. In the case of Facebook, at some point when they started going for their rounds of funding, they actually had to now go back and refile the company in a different state under a different type, make it a C Corp, which is, I think, what we recommended early on, so that they actually could structure the stock and make the changes to the organization that were needed without a requirement to completely change the bylaws and the structure of the organization every time money was introduced.
Yeah, and this was specifically important, in the case of the early days of Facebook, because, well, number one, when they first started Facebook right off in the beginning, Mark Zuckerberg had about 2/3 of the company, and Eduardo Saverin he had about 1/3. What he was supposed to be bringing to the table was the business acumen. He came from a business background. That's what he was studying. So for him to turn around and make it an LLC was kind of a bit of a misstep. And it was worse than just under normal circumstances, an LLC isn't ideal if you ever want to go out and look for funding, because it's not really set up in a way that you actually have stock or shares. It's set up that different people own different percentages of the company, and every time that you bring some new entity into the partnership, you have to restructure all that and get everybody to sign off. It's a really big problem. When you have a C corporation, people have shares, and when you bring somebody new into the mix, you can just issue new shares. Everybody has the same number of shares. It's just your shares can end up getting diluted. The fact that they had to change from an LLC to a C corporation in order to be able to get funding also opened the door for a whole bunch of additional problems for Eduardo Saverin that he wasn't really paying too much attention to. Once they decided to move to a C Corp from an LLC, Mark Zuckerberg already knew he was going for funding, knew that he had to have a VC on the horizon somewhere. But he knew that having somebody who had such a giant share of the company, who was fundamentally not adding any additional value to the company whatsoever, he was supposed to be, but by that time he was off running his own company somewhere else, and not really paying too much attention to the day to day. Zuckerberg wanted to basically minimize his influence over the company, so he took advantage of the migration from the LLC to the C Corp to hide a whole bunch of things until he was ready to execute everything. So the first thing he did, as he moved to a C Corp, is he got Eduardo Saverin to agree to give up his voting rights to Mark Zuckerberg. So that, and the excuse he made was like, listen, I'm here doing the day to day. You don't really you're off and you're busy doing other things. So he gladly gave up his voting rights. Any decision that had to be made for Facebook until after they got funding, that could always exclusively be made by Mark Zuckerberg and no longer needed the involvement of Eduardo Saverin either. So he could just make whatever changes that he wanted. So that was, again, the first big mistake as a result of that switch. If they started off as a C corporation, maybe this could have been avoided, but you can hide a whole bunch of stuff in the chaos. The second thing that ended up happening is, being that Zuckerberg had unquestioned control, he decided to go ahead and issue about 9 million additional shares, which basically doubled the number of shares in the company. And he issued those as options to everybody, in the organization who was an employee. But Eduardo Saverin wasn't considered an employee anymore. So he got diluted and nobody else did. And the other, so this is also another lesson learned. So I talked about the fact that, one of the lessons learned that you would have picked up on in a previous episode was the fact that you want to start off as a C corporation and not an LLC. The second thing is, you want to reserve a certain number of shares right off the bat to give away as stock options to attract other talent. And the fact that they were doing this late in the stage, again, it allowed that that entire event to go under the radar of Eduardo Saveron. So had they set the stuff up correctly to begin with, such a big event would have certainly raised a couple of red flags.
Well, I know that we spend a couple of episodes talking about how to structure the stock. I do know, it's interesting. It's not always a problem if they need to come back and add a pool of shares for employees at a later time. So I don't want to make sure that that doesn't come across as a negative.
Oh,
But had the company been structured correctly the first time through, and I think something you alluded to there is critically important. On almost every episode, we well, we try to mention we are not lawyers.
yes.
This is one of those places where having a good lawyer to look out after your interest would have benefited everybody involved. It's the structure of the stock, tripped up Saverin. The fact that he was away tripped him up. The fact that he did not have voting rights anymore tripped him up. And then they also set it up where he would no longer be an employee, which gave them the ability to structure those stock to employees only, which further diluted his shares and really mostly only his shares, which was an interesting side effect.
Whenever there's chaos in an organization, you can hide stuff. And that was the big thing. Like issuing new shares, generally speaking, wouldn't raise a red flag. Issuing, doubling the number of shares that you have, not a really common circumstance. And certainly, if you suddenly realize that, everybody in the company is getting shares except for you, that probably would have clued him in a little bit earlier. But again, at that point in time, he was still unaware of the fact that this was happening. And then, finally, the final step here was when they finally actually did get an investor in to do their Series A, that watered everybody down again. This time, at least, the watering down of the stock happened equally across the board. But by this time, Edward Saveron's stock went from, him owning a third of the company to him owning less than 10%. And then when they finally did go public, it was less than 5%. So that was a little bit of a sort of dramatized for effect in the movie, where they said that he got diluted down to 0.03%. That, I don't know where that number came from, but that wasn't accurate. He still came away, considering the fact that his big involvement in the company was to give them $15,000 early on. I think that still would be considered a pretty good payday.
So just to quickly recap everything that we've covered, execution is critically important. If you have someone who is fundamentally key to the success of your business, consider making them a partner in the organization. Making those employees does not always work, and as seen in this case, Facebook can really bite you hard. The second thing is make sure you found your company appropriately. C Corp is usually the advisable if you're looking to go into rounds of funding and ultimately do an initial public offering. Keep your focus at all times. We saw in the movie some things we didn't cover today, but Saverin he moved across the country. He was focused on another business, and obviously that lack of focus allowed them to take advantage of some of the situations there. Having a lawyer, absolutely critical to every single aspect of starting a company. Cannot overemphasize that. The companies I've been a part of have every single one had a lawyer as a partner in the business from day one. That way it was just included, it was a part of it, and they had a vested interest in ensuring that we were successful and not taken advantage of. And then lastly, let me call back to structuring the stock. That's not an easy topic. We had two episodes on that in our podcast already. I'm sure that we'll dive more into that into the future, into more complex topics. But in this case, that's where Saverin lost out and went from 33% ownership down to less than 10. So.
Yeah, and to sort of double down on one of the things that you said about the have a good lawyer, make sure that lawyer is your lawyer and not the company. A company's lawyer is going to look after the best interest of the company. That doesn't necessarily, I mean, in most circumstances, you would imagine that would mean that they're loyal to you too. Not always. So if it's something that possibly could be changing your position inside the company, it could be changing your structure of ownership. It could be changing anything else. You may want somebody other than the company lawyer looking at that, just so that you know that you're being taken care of.
Well, thank you for listening today. Thank you for joining in. This has been another episode of the Startup Lantern. If you like what you hear, we encourage you to tell your friends. If you've got an idea of starting a company, please drop some thoughts and questions into the chat associated with this video. We'd love to hear from you. Druce and I are talking with companies on a frequent basis about everything from partnerships to organizational structure and how that works. We'd love to have a conversation with you as well. We look forward to hearing from you. Please like or subscribe and join us on the next episode of the Startup Lantern.